Hi. So yeah, I'm Haydn. I'm going to talk about this stuff. Tonight. Thank you all for coming. I'll talk about AI governance. Can we turn just these lights off, maybe? Maybe. Yeah. So I'm in Switzerland to go to the United Nations. So I'm in Geneva this week. So I've just popped up this evening. It's negotiations about lethal autonomous weapons. So I thought that was quite nice and appropriate because some of the stuff we're going to be talking about this evening. So I'm going to rattle through some slides that just give you kind of a bit of an introduction to AI governance, and then a bit of some of the things that I'm currently working on and people are thinking about to give people a bit of a taste of this kind of new and emerging field and see whether it's of interest to people and something that people could get involved with. So in particular, I'm going to try and cover very quickly standards, antitrust, defense assurance, compute, and treaties, and we'll see how far we get through them. Well, did that work? Okay, yeah. So I'm affiliated with two centres at the University of Cambridge. One's the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. And that's the front page. That's the mission. And then the other one is the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, which is more about the study and mitigation of risks that could lead to human extinction, civilization collapse. So one of the first one, CFI, kind of does everything to do with AI, like multi-agent reinforcement learning. It does different narratives people tell about AI, all different kinds of things like that. And then CSER, or Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, does covers pandemics and nuclear war and climate change, and where they kind of overlap, like how AI could possibly become really bad for global security, is where I do most of my work. So yeah, so as I said, covers bio. This is not supposed to be like Switzerland is a global risk or something. It's supposed to represent systemic risk and kind of cascades. And then this sort of, well, maybe not obviously. That's again not some glacier up in the Alps. That's supposed to be climate change, and that's AI. So yeah, I'm gonna, as I say, try and rattle through some of these. I'll start with introducing the problem of AI governance as opposed to kind of more technical problems around AI. Yeah, so I find this quite a helpful way of thinking about things. So on this axis here, we've got things that are a problem now, things that will soon become a problem, and things that might become like a problem if something, artificial general intelligence, so highly autonomous, highly capable systems that are able to outperform humans at most economically valuable tasks. If that were developed, some of the problems there. And then to split it also into these three buckets, so around kind of safety and accidents, around misuse, and structural or systemic risks. So people might not be familiar, but there was this. I'll go through them, I guess, by column rather than by row. So there was a case a few years ago in the Netherlands where a bunch of parents got accused of being fraudulent on their welfare claims because of some AI system. And this led to a huge, they had to pay back a lot of money. Some of them got into real serious legal problems. Some of them were in trouble of losing their kids. And of course, this was just a mistake with the machine learning system. So I think this is a really nice case of some system just going wrong in some way that we would want to prevent in some way that would, some unpredictable way that causes harm. And we can imagine that pretty soon we're going to start automating more and more of our economy and society. So the electricity grid, transport systems, things like that. And if any, fleets of self-driving cars or things like that. And if those went wrong, if we had a similar problem there, that could obviously be, another scale of bad. And then at the kind of highest level, if we have these very, very capable systems, which may be possible in the next, in the kind of coming years or decades, they could exhibit certain behaviors that we don't want. So they could be misaligned with our intention, with our intentions and our values. So they don't do what we want to do. They act contrary to our interests, and there's certain reasons to believe that they could adopt certain patterns of behavior, which you could characterize as power seeking, that could be pretty harmful. Okay, so I guess I'll talk a bit about that later. I wanted to move on to misuse. So I think this is already like pretty obvious. So like in the last few days, Facebook put up, they shared very broadly this new language model they developed, and quite predictably, it's been put on 4chan, and people are going to be using it to like produce disinformation and to like mass produce the, turning out with like toxicity and stuff. So that's, that's very clear, a clear example of like current misuse, or deepfakes is another one. But then we can also imagine that pretty soon, different kind of autocracies, authoritarian regimes are going to start using AI to control their population even more. They're going to like do much better kind of all-encompassing surveillance, predicting who's going to be a dissident, using kind of drones to enforce those laws. And then we can imagine even at a larger scale, that process kind of becoming something like permanent. So we can imagine some sort of authoritarian regime is trying to like locking in their very specific view of value in a way that could be like very, very damaging for a long period of time. And so the third one is around, so this one, like there's been a mistake with the system. This one, someone's done something wrong. But this one, there's no like particular system or person to blame. It's just the way they've interacted. So a few years ago, there was something that called the flash crash on stock markets, where these bunch of automated trading algorithms interacted in this weird way, and it kind of crashed the market really quickly. And we still really don't know what happened. So it's this like emergent thing from the interaction. And then we can imagine like pretty soon, if we start including it in our defense systems, the thing I've been just spending the week talking about down in Geneva, we can imagine that like escalation could happen at machine speed. So if you've got two defensive systems on like the border between North Korea and South Korea, and then like a bird lands wrongly and one of them triggers and then the other one triggers, and it happens too fast for a human to intervene on, we can imagine that being like a kind of step up in harm from the previous one. And then finally, we can imagine this getting even like larger and leading in fact to conflict or war or some sort of wasteful arms race where people just like investing in these in some systems that like are not helping the world and are just creating more problems. So that's kind of how I view it. So I think some people sometimes think of the AI and problems around AGI as being like quite all or nothing. It's going to be like everything's fine, we don't know what's going on, and then suddenly, whoa, this huge like brand new thing's going to like suddenly disrupt things. It's like an asteroid. I view it much more as this like slow creep, and we can already see some of the problems now, and we can already see what some of the problems are going to be in a few years, and we can I think it's like reasonable to be concerned about how bad some of these things could get if AGI comes along at some point in the next few years, decades, however long it might take. Okay, so that's my suggestion of, and then I think it's useful to say like technical problems, there's like technical solutions to a lot of these things, right? There's a lot of technical work that needs to be done to like make sure that these things don't happen and to kind of fix them and to ensure that they're like robust and aligned. But a lot of these problems are also like political problems, right? They're also problems of regulation, and they're problems of the interaction of different countries in the world. So I think that's the side of things where I spend most of my time. So I thought it might be helpful to do a bit of like one way of looking at the last 10 years in AI, and then my view on what the next 10 years might involve. So why 10 years ago? Well, one, it's like a nice, neat, 1 decade. But I think there's a very good reason to do it, because AlexNet was in 2012. So there's like this really kind of like it was like state of the art. They really smashed this the ImageNet competition. This big step forward. and it kind of and it did it through deep learning. So it really kind of kickstarted what I will argue, like the last 10 years has been like this AI summer, where there's just continued technical progress and lots of academic interest and lots of investments from companies and lots of interest from governments. And it's been so to contrast it with previous AI winters where everything kind of like closed down and things didn't progress. So so I'm going to argue the last 10 years has been this kind of AI summer, where we've seen progress in image recognition, game playing. This is Go, in robotics. This is in like language modeling. This is this is from DALI from last year. I'm sure there's even better ones now. And then in like actual kind of fundamental scientific research, so that's supposed to represent, well, that's a picture from AlphaFold, which may have like basically solved the protein folding problem, this long-standing problem in science. So, and what's interesting is that the way some of these things are going, all of the things that I put on the previous slide are now being integrated increasingly into like multimodal models. So Gatto, it doesn't do it very well, but it can do like it can do the functions of a large language model. It can play Atari games. It can do image recognition, and it can control a robot arm. So this is plausibly one of the way that things are going, right? They're not just advances in all these different areas, but also they're becoming increasingly general. So that's been on the kind of technical side of things, this AI summer. But I think we've also seen a lot of interesting achievements from the AI community itself, kind of acting in the world and saying, this is how we want things to happen. So I think there's been a lot of really important and useful forward steps on ethics and safety around lethal autonomous weapons and on organizing. And basically the reason this has happened is, everybody wants to employ AI talent. There's very few. Gagne estimates it's like in the tens of thousands worldwide, which gives talented AI researchers and software engineers and things a lot of bargaining power to, one way that this is represented is like high salaries, but another way is I don't want to work on this. I want my company that I work for to have commitments against this. And in fact, the AI community has had these big successes. So these are three Future of Life Institute conferences. This one in 2015 in Puerto Rico, 2017 in Asilomar, and 2019 back in Puerto Rico. So this one was kind of like put a lot of ethics and safety on to the agenda. This one was one of the first set of ethics principles for AI, and now there are like hundreds. And this one was much more about like what should policies and governance be. These are just like a few of the many different new groups that have been set up to study kind of problems to do with AI ethics and problems to do with AI safety. So I think this is like very clearly the AI community being like, we want to study this thing, we think it's important, and just it working and like this whole field kind of emerging over this last 10 years. You've also seen this kind of internationally. So this is like largely a group of AI people from the AI community saying we're concerned about the use of AI and machine learning in weapon systems. We want there to be an international ban. And like very quickly, this got onto this international agenda, and the negotiations are ongoing in Geneva. Like I think it's fair to say that it's impressive they got it onto the international agenda, but it hasn't really, there's not many prospects towards a ban, but I think getting it on and getting a lot more kind of awareness out there and understanding of like the problems of integrating AI in defense is like a real achievement again. And then the third and final one is like organizing within tech companies. So Google used to have like pretty happy working with, for example, the US military, but then this is Project Maven, where it turns out that they were doing some image recognition project for the DoD. A lot of people, they didn't know about this. Some people work from Ireland, which is neutral, and they're like, why are we building this thing that could turn into a weapons system for the US? And so Google apologized for that. but then it turned out that they were maybe looking into building a censored search engine for China, and basically they said, we can't do this continual ethics whack-a-mole. We need some sort of set of ethics principles. And this is related to it in 2018. This is the Google Walkout for Real Change, which was around better kind of sexual harassment and sexual assault reporting. But I think it's part of this kind of with a lot of participation from AI experts like Meredith Whittaker. So yeah, I think it's another example of the kind of community being active and working together and getting real achievements. However, despite these kinds of like big successes over the last 10 years, I think that's not really going to like define the next 10 years, because I think a lot of people have realized that there are limits to what you can get through like voluntary action. So I would claim that the next 10 years is going to be defined by a lot of like regulation. So the EU AI Act here is like about to pass probably in the next like few weeks or months. It's then going to, I'm going to talk about it a bit later, it's going to then be turned into like concrete technical standards through these two committees. And the same thing is happening in the US with the AI risk management framework. And then this is also becoming a major focus of antitrust and competition law. So people might be familiar with GDPR and Digital Markets Act and stuff. The EU AI Act is kind of like in that theme. Yeah, it's passing soon. The standardization process will come. So I think there's just a few things that so this is really going to regulate quite a lot of the way that AI is used, like around the EU, but also like if you want to be selling into the EU, you're going to have to follow these kind of requirements. So it's going to affect pretty much like things worldwide. And it's going to be pretty broad, right? It's going to cover facial recognition, any use of AI in critical infrastructure. It's going to cover use in education. So like if someone's using an algorithm to like determine what grades people get, loads of employment stuff, creditworthiness, like the use by the police, migration, justice, and like very interestingly, I think over the last year, they've added general purpose AI systems. So these are things like your ChatGPTs, your large language models like that, generative AI as well. The idea is kind of like foundational models that are going to be these really big foundational models that will then get kind of fine-tuned for different applications. Those are going in as well. So it will cover those as well. And there's quite a lot of requirements, right? Like you're going to have to set up a risk management system. You're going to have to do a bunch of documentation and record keeping, which is like all very interesting. You have certain requirements, oversight. The ones I want to drill into here, I think that are probably most interesting to people in this room, are around robustness and cybersecurity. So it really is like, it's got to be resilient to errors, faults, and inconsistencies that may occur within the system. And it's got to be resilient to attempts by unauthorized third parties to alter the use of the AI systems. So like, I think this is a pretty big deal. Like it's really going to set quite a high bar for AI systems used in these areas. And so that obviously is still quite like high level and a bit kind of broad. So it's going to be made into like specific technical standards over the next 2 years. The report is due in January 2025, and it's these two pan-European standardization bodies that are going to set it. But like, I think it's really interesting. Like, so if we go back 10 years in time or something, or even 5 years when people were going to these Future of Life Institute conferences, like the idea that it was going to be passed into law what safety means, right? It's going to be like, it's not just being robust in general to misspecification or it's not very explainable. This is really going to be like, well, what that means is if you want to be using it, it has to be interpretable like on this particular benchmark, where you've got to follow this particular rule. So I think this is it. It's like it's really going to be pretty major for the field. And then around it, you're going to see this whole blossoming of an ecosystem of companies providing auditing and providing best practices advice and saying like, oh, I'm going to test your system. And I think that's a really interesting way to get just like way more people into the field of AI safety, right? And to make it's not this like nice to have thing that like a few AI researchers are concerned about. It's like key to your bottom line. And this, I just wanted to flag that this is not just happening in the EU, this is happening in the US as well. It's happening a bit elsewhere in the world, but like the US and EU are kind of trying to race ahead pretty quickly. Yeah, so as I said, it builds this AI safety community. It's going to produce a lot more research because it's like, well, what does it mean? Like, how can we actually make this more interpretable or more robust to distributional shifts, say? It builds this norm. It's like, we're not just releasing this thing and seeing what happens and fixing the problems as they go. It's like, no, we're going to test the safety before deployment, which I think is going to be really important if you, like I, are concerned about some of the kind of longer run, the problems that are associated with higher capability systems. Great opportunity over the next few years to get like actual feedback loops and get actual data about like where systems go wrong and how and what things can actually fix that. And yeah, I've defended, through this the beginning of this talk, this kind of prosaic continuous improvement view, and I think yeah, this kind of regulation is really great on those views. So yeah, this is it. Like they really want technical standards, and the AI safety field should like answer them. So that's just like that's my particular view of like what the AI governance problem is, like what's happened over the last 10 years. And one theme that's going to characterize the next 10 years. So I'm just going to like briefly now go through, if that's okay, timing wise, I think probably okay. I'm going to briefly go through just 4 topics that like are a bit random, but that I'm interested in. May have I got it? Thanks. Oh, you open the hummus? Oh yeah, that makes more sense. You're going to get me like a glass of hummus. Okay, so antitrust and competition law. So this is Xin Ha, thank you, who I've done most of this work with. So we've done a few different papers. I think we're on like 4 or 5 different papers now. So I'm just going to like briefly say what antitrust and competition law is, and then kind of introduce a couple of our papers. So antitrust all started like about 120 years ago in the US, where there were these big, people might have heard like Standard Oil or US Steel, or these like really big robber barons, right? And there were these massive monopolies that dominated their industries. And this is them as like, octopuses controlling every aspect of the market. Standard Oil was obviously oil, US Steel was steel, there were, railway barons as well. And this is like an even more kind of evocative picture where it doesn't just control the market, but it's also controlling like the Congress. It's going for the White House here, it controls these lawmakers. So the idea here is like, people were very concerned about these concentrations of political power and these political and economic power in these massive companies. And they thought, this is too much. These companies are abusing their dominance. They're forming cartels. They're harming consumers and they're harming competition. They're like holding back innovation. We need to like either break them up or control their market, their monopoly power, so that they can't do all these, all these things that harm our society and consumers directly, like by raising prices. So it was kind of like pioneered in the US, but is like very big now in the EU and in Switzerland and in the UK and elsewhere. Why is it relevant to like our question on AI governance? Well, this is just focusing on EU competition law. EU competition law has jurisdiction over any company with activities in the EU, so it's been going after US big tech companies for the last like 5 or 10 years because they're so big and have perhaps been abusing their dominance in various ways. So it's going to affect any kind of company that is involved with developing AI and is selling in the EU. The regulators are like really institutionally strong. They're really well resourced, and they're very willing to like go after big companies, and they are very influential, like worldwide. A lot of countries like take their cues from EU competition law enforcement. Yeah, as I said, they're so strong. They've got these really powerful procedural and investigative powers. You can really like compel companies to give a lot of information to you, and they can really like serious fines up to 10% of global turnover. So that's like, you know, a lot of fines recently have been in the billions or tens of billions. And in fact, they're getting even stronger because several jurisdictions have brought in this ex-ante regulatory regime, which kind of puts specific requirements on specific really big like gatekeeper companies, which, you know, unsurprisingly is the big tech companies. So antitrust is going to affect the big developers of AI, and they've got a lot of tools at their disposal. Maybe I'll just go back. Oh, there we go. Those are some of the recent fines. Yeah, so I think I'll just say that I think it's quite some of our work has looked at, you know, I've made the claim that it's really enforceable at the moment, but as AI develops, will it continue to be enforceable? We look at that and we say, yeah. We examine kind of why the ex-ante regime might be particularly useful for AI governance, and that's because it's going to focus on, you know, the companies that are likely to develop more capable AI. And we've looked at some of the ways that it can be like synergistic with AI governance goals, like you might focusing on the compute supply chain, which I'll talk about later, but also perhaps in tension. So we might want AI companies to cooperate on safety, for example, but that might cause, if it's like structured poorly and like ineptly, that could lead to antitrust concerns. So anyway, those are just like a kind of some of a flavor. I'm not, you know, trying to communicate the actual details, which is supposed to give you a flavor of why this is like an interesting topic to me and hopefully to others in the field of AI governance. Okay, so defense. Loads and loads of different militaries are trying to incorporate AI into their defense systems in different ways. However, that poses like quite a few problems. So this is from the US and this is from the UK. And as you can see here, like adapting DoD's test and evaluation, validation, and verification, enterprise for machine learning. AI systems are being like developed in the private sector. They're being developed by companies that aren't used to, they're used to just kind of putting something out and seeing what happens, and maybe it breaks, but it's fine. But you can't do that in defense. You've got to, it's got to be like really, really safe, and it's got to be secure to like an adversarial environment where people are trying to hack it and bring it down. So this makes this and a few other aspects of AI make like integrating into defense systems quite a difficult, tricky technical problem, right? So militaries aren't just going to deploy these things. They want to make sure that it's like legal and ethical and won't kill, you know, our own soldiers and won't kill civilians. And to do that, they need to go through these processes of assurance. But that is quite hard. So right now in Geneva, so that's kind of what that's within nations mostly, this kind of assurance thing. And again, this is interesting because again, it's like building up the world of people whose job it is to test and to ensure AI safety in AI systems. So that's kind of like within these countries, and then internationally, as I said, there's been this campaign to stop killer robots, and the negotiations currently. Some people say that there's stasis in the international negotiations. It's like not progressed a huge distance in the last 5 or so years. Although I would argue that there's been quite some really important kind of like norm building around like everyone knowing what the problems are with using AI in defense. But now there's this discussion from like a few people within the campaign on whether it should be taken outside the UN or to like a different venue, and whether we should like just start again, kind of trying to get a treaty anew. So that's just kind of some like it's like it's just like another branch of AI governance kind of focused on defense. I think it's and on a national and on an international level. So compute governance. Compute governance is so hot right now. Like lots of people are very interested in it. because so this is a map of the supply chain for AI hardware, right? Like so chips and cloud computing. So you've got it. It goes in 5 steps here, and then these things up here are kind of different business models. So this is something that Shinshin and I did. So it goes from like designing these chips to then making these chips. You then kind of package it all together. It's put in these, well, you know, there's different ways you could use chips, but the main way is you stick it in these like massive cloud computing providers like AWS, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud. Then you train it on this like massive amount of compute, and then it ends up in some menus. So I think this is like a very, very interesting thing for a number of reasons. So unlike data or kind of talented researchers, which are the other kind of 2 main inputs to AI progress, compute's really big. You can count it. It's very obvious when it's kind of moved around. It's very expensive. And then also, it's only produced by a small number of companies in the whole world, right? So in phones, for example, ARM had like a huge, I think it's something like 80 or 90% of the market for the chips on your phones. People will be familiar perhaps with ASML, who produced the kind of machines that make chips, photolithography machines. There's one company, ASML in the Netherlands, that does that. For fabrication, there's one company, TSMC in Taiwan, that can produce like the highest end chips. This is more competitive, but with cloud computing, again, there are like 3 main providers in the whole world. And because it's so expensive, increasingly, like there's only a few number of AI companies that can like really compete. So I think this is really interesting because you can really, it's possibly like a much easier thing to regulate and a much easier thing to focus on than these other aspects of like trying to, you know, data is not that concentrated, and it's much easier to like copy and to share. It's much harder to nail down, because compute might have a lot of advantages. And indeed, we've seen some of this be recognized already by international politics, because last year, the Biden administration took a lot of like very interesting and quite big steps to cut off China's access to high-end chips. So this wasn't motivated by an AI kind of concern. It was motivated by the fact that these chips kept on being found on like Chinese planes and missiles and things, and they were like, oh, the only way we can stop these chips getting into these weapons is to like completely exclude China's access to these chips. But so they cut off access to design, they cut off access to, like ASML can't export to China, and they stopped TSMC and others from exporting to into China. And it's basically worked over the last 6 months. Like it really does seem to have slowed China's ability to acquire or build high-end chips. And, you know, of relevance to this discussion, high-end AI capabilities. But of course, we don't yet know how China will react. But I think it's like a really interesting thing, and a really like, you know, this is like where major international competition is happening. It's like happening at the level of this this massively important and hugely expensive and very complex supply chain. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why people are so interested in compute and some interesting kind of things about it. And then I'll just end with something that I've been thinking about a fair amount recently, which is if you're in some sort of like racing situation, and then I think there's been a lot of focus on what should the like leader in that race do with their advantage. How can they make sure that they like invest properly in safety or try and act in a legitimate way? I think there's been a little less focus put on what does the like runner-up, the laggard, do in that situation. So imagine that you know, you're going to reach advanced AI before me, and I know that for like, I'm pretty certain about that within 2 years. What are my options? One is just like, okay, go along with, you can use your capabilities however you want. Another one is we reach some agreements about what you do with your capabilities before you deploy them. And the other one is that, like, if you won't come to some agreement with me, and I'm really still worried, I'm going to start making. I could begin to start making threats of coercive action, like, you know, putting sanctions on you or threatening to hack you or things like that. And I think that's pretty worrying, right? Because that could quite easily escalate and lead to international tensions or even conflict. So I would think that some sort of agreement on how whoever develops advanced, you know, highly advanced AI capabilities, some sort of agreement on how those are used. So yeah, on when and on how that rival will deploy that AI. So I think that's going to cover, like, it's going to be safe, but I think it's also probably going to cover, like, what the uses you will put that those highly capable AI systems to. If you're going to use them to develop, like, weapon systems, well, I probably will not be very keen on that. But if you're going to use it to develop, like, a cure for cancer, well, that seems fine, right? We can kind of come to some agreement on that. How, like, any agreement like that is going to depend on quite a lot of kind of assurances on both sides. But I think there's lots and lots of interesting stuff that could be done here. You know, you could give me access to your training data. I could give me, I could, like, give you pre-approval before you do a training run. We could have special, like, new kinds of hardware that are harder to tamper with. We could even do maybe partition training runs, things like that. So there's all these kinds of, like, technical things that would be really interesting. We could also, I could also just, like, know where all your big data centers are and the chips they have and how many chips they're producing and importing and where are those going. So I can have some sense of, like, oh, well, it's not the case that, you know, you're developing some, like, scary AI that I need to be concerned about in this data center over there, because I know what all your data centers are doing, because maybe I'm doing inspections, or maybe I'm, like, doing surveillance from satellites. And the same thing for talent, right? Like, there's not some, like, weird Apollo project out there somewhere in your country, because I know where all, like, most of your talented researchers are. So I think all of those would just, like, give both sides in these kinds of situations a lot more reassurance that there's not any cheating going on. So that's what I call the rival deployment problem, and I think this is is quite, like, an interesting topic for AI governance. And I think it's interesting, especially because there's lots and lots of, like, very juicy, like, open technical problems that people can kind of dig into, right? So, like, a lot of this stuff was there were loads of, like, technical progress that was made on similar things around chemical weapons or around, like, nuclear weapons or bioweapons, things like that. There's all this stuff yet to be done for AI. So, oh, have I come to the? Okay, I thought I had a final slide summarizing, but I'll go back to here. So yeah, so I've kind of introduced what I see as a lot of the problems in AI governance. Talked a bit about, like, one way of thinking about the last 10 years, one way of thinking about the next 10 years, and then introduce some of the things that I've been thinking about and working on over the last year or so, and I'm probably going to continue working on. So that's stuff around antitrust, stuff around how do you do better assurance in defense. Can you govern compute in an interesting way? What does that, like, allow you to do? And then how do we think about, like, the kind of, like, game theory of some of these of the kind of the process of how do we think about how to kind of control and limit and, like, carefully manage the transition to increasingly capable AI systems. Okay, cool. Well, that's that. So if people have questions, I'd be very keen to get into a discussion. Thanks.